All right, on our last video, we looked at surveys and in-depth interviews, two of our key research designs for getting information about social life. We're going to look at two more now. These are the four main research designs. Again, this is thinking about how do we get information about our social world. We saw that surveys were big questionnaires that are good at getting descriptive data about the world and correlation, whereas in-depth interviews get us a lot of what's going on inside your head. Now we're going to look at experiments and observational research. So most of us tend to think of experiments as the basis of science, and in a certain sense they are. But for us, they're really one type of research design. So you'll remember when I talked about surveys, I'm sure you have every word burned into your mind, that I noticed that if we look at, for example, how old people are and whether they're more likely to wear masks, we might say that age is causing people to wear a mask. It's a reasonable assumption, but we can't actually prove the cause. We don't know that there's something else in there, not just age, but maybe wealthier people are more likely to wear masks, and older people tend to have more money because they live longer, depending on the community. That's a big statement. What experiments really help us do is identify the causal relationship. And they do this by isolating and manipulating a particular causal force. Right? So this is done a couple different ways, but the idea is that we filter out all the other noise around race or gender or wealth, and we just boil it right down to age. And we see if someone's older, if they're definitely more likely to wear a mask. So experiments can be done out in the world, or what we say in the field, or in a laboratory setting like the one we see here. These have different strengths and weaknesses. In the laboratory setting, they tend to be highly set up. There's fairly famous and controversial social experiments that have been set up in the lab. But we might bring someone in and give them a certain scenario and see whether or not they put a mask on, for example. And there are ways we can be sure that the one thing that we're looking at varying here is the causal factor, age. Right? And again, that's the whole point, is that if we what we call manipulate that cause, meaning we change it, right, then if nothing happens, then we know that's not the cause. So for example, if we think that relationships break up more when the room is hotter, we might bring more couples. This would be totally unethical, but we might bring potential couples into a room and manipulate just the temperature. We wouldn't change anything else. This would be wild. This would never be done. But again, it's the point of like what we're doing is we're just changing the temperature. And we're bringing in the lab in some senses to field everything else out. We tend to do this over and over again to really get strong observation. Part of that's because this is also quantitative data, meaning if they break up or if they put on a mask, that's recorded as either a 1 or a 0. It's recorded and put into a data set, and we see if it's statistically more likely. I won't get into the weeds on this, but basically statistics are going to be more accurate the more cases and observations we have. There's a limit to that, but it's better to have 300 tests than 100, simply put. We can also do what we call field experiments. These are a little bit trickier, but if you've ever seen one of those shows like What Would You Do, that's kind of like a half-assed experiment. They don't really weed out external causes, but they try to manipulate people in the field or in real life. The better and stronger examples of these we'll look at with race and gender are what we call audit studies. And this is where we send out something like a resume to a firm that's hiring, and we send out essentially the exact same resume in terms of maybe your education and your qualifications and your skills and the school you went to and your references, and the only thing we change, that causal variable that we're manipulating or changing, is race. And there have been a lot of famous studies done like this. And what we tend to find is, even if people are similarly qualified, they can, all the things the same except for race, the white person is more likely to get hired. Right? And when someone like my brother, who argues with me about this stuff, says, no, 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 it's not about race, and we can say, you know what, it's not about those other things because we controlled for all that. Right? We made sure all that was the same, and we know that it was, in fact, race, because that's the only thing that was different between the two. And again, here we would do this statistically, and what this means is that it's more likely that the white person is going to get called back for it, or the woman, or the non-felon. Now, like surveys, experiments can be expensive. Getting people in a lab, getting people to run experiments is expensive. Sending out a bunch of resumes that you may never get any response whatsoever is pretty expensive. Paying people to call into housing to see if they're more likely to get an apartment based on their accent. It's the kind of study we've done. Those are all expensive to do. You have to get a lot of people involved. It takes a lot of time. The other issue you need to worry about with field experiments, particularly in the lab setting, is what we call reactive measurement. This is true of the next design as well. And the worry here is that what you're measuring is not what would happen in the field or in the real world, but the reaction to the experiment itself. So they're reacting to you running an experiment, not to how they would in real life. All right, the last one is field work and observation. This means we are out in the field, out in the world. We are where we want to be. We might want to look at a soccer club. We might want to look at college students at HBCUs. We might want to look at behavior in a predominantly gay nightclub. What this involves primarily is direct participation and observation in the area in which you're studying. So whether or not you're actually participating in the activity, that can be more or less. We've had people who've researched female white supremacists who haven't obviously participated in their activity, but have essentially kind of ridden along and followed them around and participated with them. The data here is primarily qualitative, because what we're doing when we're observing is writing down every damn thing we can. How hot is it? What color is the room? How do they sound? What's their tone of voice? Who's there? What are they wearing? It's really, really rich data. It's a skill to get down, taking field notes, and then people go home and write those out in much more detail. So these are really good at getting at behavior and processes as they unfold in the workplace, in the consumer, in the supermarket. But observational work also does typically take a lot of time. You typically have to become a part of the community. People have to gain your trust. You have to gain entree. You have to get people to trust you, basically. And here, reactive measurement is a worry as well. But there's really no data that's really quite like direct observation. It can be very rich and very good data. So, if we wanted to, for example, get at how preschool children maintain gender boundaries, well, we can't really survey them because they don't know how to read. And we might interview them, but it's probably going to be better just to watch what they do. And you're going to get a much more kind of rich example of how they actually behave in everyday life. So you might want to pause on this part of the slide and think about what of these designs, what of these methods might really be best to answer some of these questions. Think about what kind of data would be best to answer these questions. Would we want more quantitative descriptive or more rich and processual data? Would we want to get people subjective opinions or just observe them? Would observing them make sense? So think about it, because we'll come back to this in our class session. Here's a quick summary. Different key perspectives. You can skip that part on operationalization. And what we'll talk about in our discussion period is the ethical concerns around research. In addition to digging into these a bit more and explaining them, thinking about the morals of researching human beings.